Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour et bienvenue à l'Institut. Good afternoon and welcome to this lunch briefing entitled No Longer Too Big to Fail, Sino-American Relations and the Ukraine War. I'm Dan Graham. I'm the head of communications here at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Today's presentation will be given by Professor Hanhimäki. Professor Hanhimäki has been a faculty member since 2000. And was previously a lecturer at the London School of Economics. From 2002 to 2003, he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and is the recipient of the 2002 Bernath Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. And in 2006, he was elected Finland Distinguished Professor. His main research interests include American foreign policy, transatlantic relations, and the international history of the Cold War. And before I hand the stage over to Professor Hanhimäki, I would just like to explain how our lunch briefings work, just in case this is the first time you come to one of these. First part is a presentation, which roughly is 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session for the last half hour. During that Q&A, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We will provide you with microphones. And just wait for the microphone, because that way everyone in the room can hear, and also those who have joined us online can hear the questions as well, because we are also recording this. And for those of you joining us online, well, very welcome to you as well. And I'll be moderating the questions in the last half hour, and I will be verifying, the questions online as well. And I promise I'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but we will have to end at 1:30 sharp. So without any further ado, I will hand over the stage to Professor Hanhimäki. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Dan. It's a nice introduction. If anybody wants to know how I did in high school, I can tell you afterwards, but maybe that's not appropriate right now. As Dan said, the talk of the day is on Chinese-American or Sino-American relations, and in particular within the context of the Ukraine war. That started last year in February, and that has preoccupied many of us in terms of thinking, debates, and so forth for the last 14 months. Before I go into it, I just want to, general point, and my chance to make a pitch for my particular department at the Graduate Institute. I think the last year, this talk that I do today and everything that's going on, as we say, really underlines the importance of history in current and how we regard history, the abuse, the misuse, the instrumentalization of history, so-called historical lessons. We've heard, all kinds of things about empires and empire building. We've heard about, the Munich Accords and what it led. We've heard about the Second Cold War, or Cold War 2.0, as we sometimes think of our present moment. These are all historical references that build upon narratives that we have in different places, different narratives, and how we feel comfortable with certain narratives over others, of course. There is no one right narrative. I think that should be clear for most. And ultimately, of course, history doesn't provide us with complete answers. It gives you perspective, it gives you context, and that's hugely important, of course, in understanding if you try to dissect what's being said and argued and where we might be actually heading, which I'm not sure if I can tell you exactly today. So, just as this, and again, this flag, this here sort of reminds those of us who are a bit older about the Cold War, of course, and how if you replace the flag on the right with the flag of the Soviet Union, which is no longer much in use, at least not officially, then we see the same kind of sort of the historical memory here. What I want to start with is just to remind you of where we are roughly today in terms of the Chinese-American relationship. We are in a massive state of tension and ambiguity. And I am a cartoonist or cartoon fan, and my students know this very well. So, and I always admired cartoonists in a way they can capture something visually and in a very often funny way, as you know, some of the giggles here imply. But yes, of course, we've seen in the last few months, we've seen the balloon crisis, we've seen things going on with spies being arrested recently. You know, if you go a little bit back in time, we remember all the brouhaha about TikTok and conversely YouTube, of course, in China and so on and so forth. We are in a period of extreme tension that, while funny perhaps in the cartoon format, of course, is also very potentially extremely serious. If you think about, certainly in the last few weeks, we've seen the military exercises near Taiwan that many see as a sort of rehearsal for a potential invasion coming up. So the and however, at the same time, of course, we have the what is the biggest, most important bilateral relationship, one could argue, in the 21st century between China and the United States. And it's, of course, it's filled with ambiguity. Even the US-Taiwan policy, I'll talk about that a little bit, hopefully, later on, is, of course, based on a specific kind of ambiguity about what each side really wants and plans to do. So we are in a situation of tension, lots of question marks. Tipping point is one of those terms that I'll come back to in a moment. Are we there? Now, why is this so much in the news today? Is related. It's not a consequence simply of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but of course the Ukraine war has created a lot of, on this continent in Europe, it has been a bit of a game changer in many ways. This is a depiction of one of the headlines or front pages in an English newspaper, one of the tabloids, if you will, redrawing map of Europe in blood, which reminds us about the terrible human consequences of the invasion that started on February 24th of 2022. 14 months into it, we have seen in this last little over a year, of course, one thing we've seen is how what we still somehow like to call the West, and we can dissect that particular term, if you will, coming together in a way that perhaps was certainly not anticipated in the famous Trump era that just preceded this the invasion of Ukraine. And we've seen, of course, the United States stepping up in support of Ukraine, sovereignty and so forth, with military aid, NATO coming together in a way that perhaps never before, and NATO, of course, enlarging just a couple of weeks ago with my native country, Finland, joining as the 31st member of NATO, and hence more than doubling the border that NATO has with Russia, which might become a bit of a problem going forward. And this, the other side of this, of course, is that Russia has been sanctioned as much as possible. What we see here is some of the reductions in imports from Russia in key countries, and you see the significant, U.S. reduction by 100%, which is probably not entirely accurate, but close there. So that's one side of the Ukraine story and the impact of the war that is ongoing, and with, one could say, not really a clear end in sight at the moment. The other thing, of course, is that we've seen another ambiguous relationship becoming perhaps a little bit less ambiguous, and that's the relationship between China and Russia. And just the recent visits of Xi Jinping. My Chinese friends will correct my pronunciation, I'm sure, afterwards, but I'll do my best. And talks with Vladimir Putin and so forth. There is a prospect of another Sino-Russian alliance, that of course then brings to many the sort of memories of the Cold War, the early Cold War period. In this case, of course, the balance of power is very different. It is China that is the big brother in some ways in that particular relationship, and Russia the supplicant in that context. So history playing interesting games as well. So there's no question that with the Ukraine war, a number of things have changed, and the sort of reminders of how the world was divided has become one of the tropes that we see in many, many scholarly and journalistic articles. And I mentioned, Cold War 2.0 now between the United States and China is there. So that's the situation today. Now, what I want to do next is just go back 50 years, just as a warning. And and my point here is I want to think a little bit back in terms of the title of this talk, which is it too big to fail? Is it like Credit Suisse that actually isn't too big to fail? Or is this relationship really headed the Credit Suisse way in some ways into some kind of a collapse and crisis? And the last 50 years tells a different story to me. Doesn't tell me that, yes, now we are at the brink of utter collapse. And that's one of the points that I want to make next. And I just want to go back the 50 years that I said. The picture here is Zhou Enlai and Richard Nixon having dinner in 1972 during Richard Nixon's famous visit in February 1972 to Beijing, and which sort of signaled the so-called opening to China, or the opening to America, which way you want to look at it is up to you. But an opening of a relationship that really had not existed since the Chinese Revolution was concluded in 1949. Now, the relationship back then was very different, of course, from the relationship that we have half a century later. China was in many ways a backward country. It was very much what we would at the time have called a third world country. But it was, of course, as Nixon's quote there points out, a country with massive potential, in part because of the massive population, which at the time was roughly a quarter of the world's population. Today it's about, I guess, 1/6 or something along those lines. So there's been some shift there. But it is, what Nixon there predicts is that the country is likely, just because of its sheer size, its population, and so forth, is likely to rise and become, as he predicted already in 25 years, a decisive factor in international affairs. In many ways, Nixon's predictions are proved correct, of course, as we look forward to the present, if not exactly the timing as such. And the relationship evolved, as you probably many of you know. That was the famous opening, but this continued during all the American presidencies that followed in the Cold War era. China was considered in the United States as a strategic partner in the Cold War, given the relationship between China and the Soviet Union, which was far from being a cozy one. There have been border conflicts in the late 1960s, the Sino-Soviet conflict already in the early 1960s, and so forth. So it was viewed from the United States as a partner against the Soviet Union. And there are quotes. Henry Kissinger once called China our best NATO partner, which sort of indicates a certain kind of thinking about geopolitics and how they matter. The point is, in very much sort of, and if I add the third president that comes after, that whether it's Nixon, whether it's Carter, whether it's Ronald Reagan, China was viewed largely as an asset for the United States in its Cold War, in the Cold War environment. And what it meant is that China's beginning of the Chinese transformation under Deng Xiaoping was effectively also viewed as something that certainly would not be an obstacle for the United States in its effort to maintain an edge over the USSR. What comes from this period, of course, is also that ambiguity about Taiwan, sorry, the famous Shanghai Communique, which Nixon had signed, in essence states in 1972 that the United States and the People's Republic of China agree that they disagree. That for the Chinese there is but one China, of course, and for the United States they agree that Chinese have this perspective. I mean, that's the sort of in a nutshell what is being said in the Shanghai Communique. The relationship also, because in these beginning years, much else is ignored in this particular context. Things that are important in U.S. relations with the Soviet Union, such as human rights and so forth, really do not play a role in the early period after the rapprochement of the 1970s. So, voila. And we all know the next part of this story, which is that China grows massively and rapidly into an economic superpower. And it's in particular obvious, let me put these up there, it's particularly obvious in the context both of the, on the left you see the sort of the US-China trade relationship that surges, particularly in the early decades of the 21st century, after China accedes into the WTO, so down the lake there. I remember we had to evacuate that part of the building at the time because the Chinese delegation was coming and the HED was renting that space, so we got kicked out, but no grudges there. But the what we have is obviously two things about this, which is that it's rapidly increased. Not even the so-called Great Recession did much to blunt the growth of Sino-American trade. And the imbalance, of course, there, which was important in domestic U.S. context, particularly in the 2016 election, when Donald Trump made a huge fuss about being ripped off by China, or China, as he called it at the time. So that's one part. The other thing is that with this growth, China and the United States clearly have been, over the last few decades, the two main drivers of economic growth. U.S. in part because it is so important for China's external trade as a market, and was particularly in the early part of the 21st century. We've seen, of course, at the same time is the story about U.S. decline, an age-old story going back to at least the 1970s, but rekindled in the early part of the 21st century as well. Now, in the end, what we have is the two largest economies in the world. The EU has a huge economy, but if you think of two national economies, the paradox within that context, of course, still today is that China claims in the WTO, as I was reminded by some of my students on Tuesday, it's a developing nation, which is an interesting paradox if you think about the size of the Chinese economy and so forth. It also, the last point I want to make about this slide before moving to the next one, is if you look at the two pies. What is to me interesting, particularly on the right side, which is the sort of prediction for 2023, is the biggest part of that pie is not China, it's the so-called rest of the world. I come back to that in a moment, in a sense that this is not a world controlled and run by two superpowers. that the bilateral relationship, while significant, ultimately depends upon, increasingly, about the rest of the world. You know, what sometimes we call either global south or something else. And that's where the growth clearly is, the next stage of growth will be driven by that, which also would then mean that the interest of both the United States and China in improving or developing their relations with the so-called rest of the world is a primary goal, should be a primary goal in going forward. So let me move on to the other part of the story, which is while on the one hand, yes, these are the drivers of the global economy, so forth. But we also see, of course, it's increasingly the move from a strategic partnership to a strategic rivalry. So what we have is countries that are deeper and deeper in terms of their economic development, interconnected through trade and investment and so forth. At the same time, we see the strategic rivalry clearly increase. What we have here, however, 2 points about that needs to be, and thinking in terms of military spending and so forth. The United States obviously still, this only goes to 2020, but the overall picture remains roughly the same. In terms of military spending, the United States clearly is in one class, and then the rest of the world comes somewhere quite far behind still today. It's a good thing or a bad thing we can debate, but that's a sort of a fact. And particularly if we consider the US and its alliances, NATO, but also other alliances, then in terms of sheer military firepower, that's where it all is. Not all, but that's where the most significant portion of the military power still lies. So that's one part of the story. Now that imbalance, however, does not mean that there's not a challenge, particularly what we've seen flare up in many ways, certainly in the last few weeks with Taiwan and so forth, and of course the perennial crisis over the South China Sea. This is actually a cartoon going back several years, back to 2016, in fact, when this was obviously one of those big issues. Now that crisis has not been resolved. What it basically does is it creates difficulties going forward in both, for both sides. At the minimum, it sort of risks the possibility of conflict, because what is happening clearly is that the countries that we see represented here, in terms of their military relationships, they tend to be the regional players in the South China Sea. Regard China as a problem, as a challenge, as a disruptor. And what that means then in reverse is that means that the United States, with the so famous pivot to Asia, but going back to the Obama years, that is very much ongoing, and the alliances in that area are being strengthened, but at the same time, the military cooperation as well. So it's one of those very tense areas in this in the relationship at the moment, and likely to be so going forward. So let me come to the big question then, which is whether this is a tipping point that we are at now, or is it déjà vu? And this is one of those problems and questions that a historian is somewhat ill-equipped to answer. But I will try to give you one perspective. There is no certainty. Accidents, of course, can happen. Anybody who reads Ken Follett's novels, if you read the last one, which is titled Never, it's exactly about this, and how in the end a nuclear war begins between China and the United States. Now, that's fiction, happily. But But there is, I think, in many cases, as we've seen also, and historians who have uncovered, you know, the history of the Cold War and things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, note that you know, chance often also can play a major role in triggering something that was not sort of rationally planned by anybody prior to that. But hopefully, you know, that is something that nobody can ultimately very effectively control. Now, the point about my question, or questions, is that, and like I said, cartoons are cool. We've, of course, been here before. The cartoon here, which shows Barack Obama pivoting to Asia, where the China lies happily in the South China Sea, building an island or constructing a new island that it claims as its own territories. And of course, the quote that we have here from 2015, which basically says that in every relationship there is a tipping point or a point of no return, and China and the United States are rapidly approaching this point. That is October 2015. Now, more recently, just last month, in fact, David Shambaugh, who's a professor at, I believe, at Georgetown, this cartoon, which simply shows Xi Jinping and, of course, President Joe Biden. And Biden there says that America's one China policy is not confusing. There is one China based in Beijing that better keep its hands off the other China. The ambiguity that is there, and of course this would not be the Chinese view at all. The Ukraine conflict that is ongoing, of course, is pivotal in understanding how the tensions have increased, I think. That certainly it's called into, because any war anywhere, it's that forces, countries, leaders, alliances choose to choose sides. It is at the root of much of present-day tension. And, of course, that is very troubling. It's troubling that we see perhaps the strengthening of two kinds of alliances. One, this is the Sino-Russian alliance, perhaps, and the other one, the so-called West, with the United States at the head, but NATO as the core of this. And yet, at the same time, if there's ambiguity in the American approach to Taiwan, there is a great deal of ambiguity in terms of China's approach to the Ukraine conflict. Which we see not as much in the headlines as the conflict and crisis and tensions increasing, but surely the fact that China plays a sort of a stepping back role in terms of the UN Security Council, whatever that means, and we can interpret it in any number of ways. The fact that China is constantly reinforcing the fact that they will not provide military assistance, which is seen as, by many, like David Shambaugh, as the real tipping point. It's not providing military assistance to Russia, which, of course, may one day actually happen. And who knows, what's happening underneath there. But there's a clear reluctance, it seems to me, actually on both sides. And we've seen the clear reluctance of the United States to indeed either engage directly with Russia, to risk an outright war between NATO and Russia. And there is a reluctance, it seems to me, on the side of the United States, to really go that one step forward that might risk an outright descent to some form of military conflict. So my conclusion then about this game of chess, which is is likely ongoing for quite some time, is probably that, just to say that the bilateral Chinese-American relationship is undoubtedly, when measured by almost any criteria, the most important bilateral relationship that we see in 2023. It has the most impact on the global economy, and it's clearly the main cause of potential conflict, because both countries are global players in any number of ways. The other point, though, is that because they are global players, they're no longer unitary actors that can decide for others what's going to happen. That in the end, the key probably lies in terms of the future, and the future also of the Sino-American relationship is how these two big players, the United States on the one hand, China on the other, how they're going to relate, and in some cases repair their relationships or build new kinds of relationships with countries like India, like Brazil, most of Africa, and so forth. Countries that we often leave out of these discussions, but ultimately are both the future providers of global growth and the potential sources of that growth being stifled in any number of ways, but also increasingly powerful in a way that they can extract. And here the comparison to the Cold War is interesting. They can extract resources from China, from the United States, or elsewhere, because both China and the United States certainly need more friends, need more allies, need more support on their side. So the Chinese proverb, so I'm told, that we shall indeed live in interesting times, but it's not a world that is going to be bilateral or bipolar, to use those old Cold War terms. It is already, and it's likely to get more and more so, a multipolar one, in which often more transactional in many ways, since we do lack, in terms of comparisons to the Cold War, there is no clear-cut ideological divide that we can sort of group countries under in a way that arguably, and this is to be much argued about, the Cold War provided such a straightforward, at least seemingly straightforward divide. But if you take my classes, it wasn't quite as straightforward as all that. Anyway, but so I guess my conclusion would be obviously that we are living, in terms of the Sino-American relationships and its impact on the world, increasingly in this more transactional, unpredictable, and multipolar world, in which, yes, triggers like the Ukraine war shift things and shift alliances and dependencies, but not necessarily in a sort of game-changing way, creating a whole new world order. So there I shall say thank you, I shall say merci, and I'm going to try to say 谢谢. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for the presentation. So as mentioned at the beginning, this is the Q&A section. And for those in the room, if you do have questions, please raise your hand and we'll make sure a microphone comes to you. For those online, please feel free to ask your questions through the tool and we'll have them right here. So just want to see if there's any questions first here in the room. Yes, we already have a question here in the second row. And we'll just wait for the microphone to come so that we can make sure that everyone who's participating online can hear this as well. And again, that this is being recorded.
Professor, absolutely brilliant. Thanks so much for that. You cited Ken Follett's fictional work.
My main source, yes.
There's another one that you might want to refer to, Jim Stavridis, 2034. a novel which talks about a very live war between the United States and China, and which I wrote Jin after I read the book. I found it totally unrealistic. Why would she want to get into that kind of a conflict? Why would Biden want to get into that kind of a conflict? Trump, that's another matter, but Xi and Biden, why would they want to go in that direction when it does so much damage to everything else they're trying to do around the world?
So thank you very much. And Stavridis, of course, is the former Supreme Commander of NATO, if I recall correctly. So, yeah, no. So on novels, on fiction, and in some ways, fiction is like what we make the prognosis of the future of, I don't know, economic growth and things like that. They can be looked at in a number of ways, but many would look at them as sort of warnings as what might happen, and hence, do something about it, avoid this, because the consequences will be as wide as possible. I haven't read this particular book, but I will certainly put it on my list. So
it's an easy read.
I'm sure, yeah. So, but yeah, in terms of, I think again, I think you're right in a sense that in terms of interests, if it's a purely interest-based sort of transactional world, there's no point in going to war. Who's going to gain? There's going to be cost. It's going to be very unpredictable, as you've seen. I don't think the Russian war has gone quite according to plan over the last 14 months. Hugely unpredictable as to what the consequences are. If you have two countries that, in the end, are in some ways at the apex of the world in terms of wealth, influence, power, almost any kind of matrix. Conflict, war, will risk that. And so that would be a sort of thing against it. Now that doesn't mean necessarily it's going to happen like that. I mean, rational thinking doesn't always prevail. And we've seen that in many ways. And,
That's the point of Stavridis' book.
Yeah. So not everybody, and in terms of history, how we think about the past and how we got here and so forth, there are so many different possible interpretations that, if you take the classical example today, is that in the Chinese perspective, they are a great, the Middle Kingdom, right? But they were used and abused by Western imperialists for a very long time, and now this is a process of bringing China back to where it used to be. That's not necessarily the way others look at China's current policies, especially if, and while something that may seem very sort of regarded as very positively in China, it may, of course, also mean that if you are then in one of the neighboring places, if you're in Japan, if you're in Vietnam, if you name it, that sort of return of China to greatness is actually not necessarily a net positive development. And so, yeah, so anyway. But absolutely, this will be on my reading list for the...
Thank you for that question. Is there another question here in the room? This gentleman here, and then we have one in the back row, and then I'll take a question online, because we have one online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your interesting presentation. As you know, as a historian, it happened quite a lot. Then when you have two great powers, at the end, they tend to go to conflict. I mean, go back to Rome, to Egypt, and so on. I mean, the list, unfortunately, is quite long. Except if we decide at some point to be a bit more intelligent and to create a cooperation mechanism, as it's what happened with the European Union or the European community at that time. You don't think to avoid any kind of situation where antagonism is growing so much that the end conflict appears just normal. There is an urgent need to create this kind of cooperation mechanism, be it bilateral, be it multilateral, to avoid the great mistakes of the past?
Yeah, so there is, of course, the idea of the Thucydides trap, right? When there's a declining power, rising power, and eventually they will, it's inevitable, like Athens and Sparta and so on and so forth, they will go to war. And that will have apocalyptic consequences to one side and so forth. Now, that's an interesting theory, and one can find history is funny, as you find, history is important. You can find plenty of evidence to point this, but you can also find, of course, counterexamples. If you think about how, say, the Cold War ended in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was not, it was a different kind of process, and it was, by and large, a non-violent process in a sense that it has, of course, left all kinds of wounds behind that we are now living with, but it wasn't there was not the necessity of a cataclysm. And I think one of the reasons for that was that prior to the late 1980s, in the couple of decades prior to that, in the 70s and 80s in particular, a lot of mechanisms have been created that cross that East-West divide, particularly in Europe. If you think about the CSCE and today's OSCE and so forth, a lot of those mechanisms were put in place that clearly improved the communications, made it more predictable in terms of what what was going on the other side, and I think as such they therefore made the world, or Europe, but the European continent at least, a safer place in some ways. So that's certainly important. Now today, I mean, you're right. Of course, we have so many different institutions just here in Geneva, right? In which both the United States and China are members of. Often the members there so that they can criticize each other perhaps, but it also creates that there are the connectivity is certainly much improved from what one could imagine even in the late 80s and early 90s. So that's actually a positive thing. The other thing that I think we should keep in mind, of course, is that when we think about threats, obviously we are living in the midst of a war on the European continent, and that has brought back all these memories of World War II and, if all of the, wars of the Yugoslav dissolution or whatever. There's an interstate war in Europe for the first time since, almost not quite a century, but a very, in sort of recent memory. And so that's a massive blowback to ideas about cooperation and security and how we can do it. So that is one thing, and that we cannot avoid thinking about. The other thing, though, that one needs to think about is that is interstate war, are these types of military conflicts going forward really the threat that threatens us most as a species, so to speak? And I guess that's where we get into perhaps the area of a bit of a blah blah about environment and so forth. But these are real things that has also the potential. If you're looking for common denominators across national borders and so forth, there are plenty of those today. As a consequence of interconnectivity, all these institutions and so forth, there's also a possibility perhaps to do something about some of these things, as we've seen with the agreements about the environment. So that aspect, especially when, last one, I know I go on forever when I start talking, but the last aspect to that is what I was, my point about the much more multipolar world, is that it's going to be increasingly difficult to dominate, for a couple of countries to dominate the world, if the problems and the challenges are shared by everybody. So that is, sort of maybe some kind of incentive at least towards cooperation. And I think we see in the case of the Ukraine conflict, we see some versions of this with various peace plans being put together, not obviously directly by the United States or Russia, but rather, other countries coming into to ameliorate the situation, in part because, again, it's hurting that interconnectivity. It's making trade supply lines very complicated. It is playing on things like inflation are in part related to this. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there before.
That's fine. That's fine.
Here forever.
That's good. And we have a question in the back row.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So you said that relationship now between U.S. and China are mostly transactional. And what we see is that there is a lot of trade being done, but U.S. runs a big deficit, right? And China has imperial ambitions. So do you believe there is a leverage from the U.S. to counter those imperial ambitions, with China by saying, listen, we can harm a lot your, trade, your exports, which is essential for your economy, or those imperial ambitions and, when you see One Belt, they're actually it's going to Europe, and you saw Macron's comments. Were you astonished by them? So what you believe on those, first of all, will transaction dominate over Chinese ambitions, imperial, and how Europe is going to cope with all this, and also, the Macron remarks, is it surprising to you, or you believe the West, Western Europe will stick like it does now, where there's a bloc with the US, and also Japan, Australia, Korea? Thank you.
Great. Lot of interesting points. Let me start with the last point you made about Macron and the West. The West is not a unitary thing. It never has been, never will be. It's always a very conflict-ridden community of nations, right? In which, traditionally France has sort of been the bad boy often in terms of, if you think back to de Gaulle and what have you. Yes, there's been always that peculiar thing that has made that transatlantic community a very, in some ways, unstable, it seems. Unstable yet enduring. And that's the paradox of that particular relationship, the transatlantic relationship that we have. Yes, now take NATO as an example. We have 31 countries now in NATO, possibly 32 later on this year if Sweden also gets a pass from Turkey. But it is not. It came together very impressively. You think back 1 year, and very impressive. But anybody who's sort of regarded NATO and its history and the transatlantic relationship would probably have said, this won't last. This won't last because the interests are not identical for France and the United States. The security concerns in Finland are somewhat different from those in Portugal or Iceland and so forth. So, there is not a total unanimity on anything within NATO. And NATO's history is filled with crises. It's filled with crises, whether it's about so-called out-of-area issues. You think about the Iraq War in the early 2000s. Even Kosovo just before that created some issues, etc., etc. So if you think about, go back to the Suez Crisis of 1956, we see a problem there. The United States involvement in Vietnam created a major blowback against the United States within Western Europe, among other places. So it is not a relationship that is in that sense, united. However, it stays together exactly because of that, and that's my point. Because in the end, what unites these countries, other than yes, the geopolitical sense, of course, one can see a community here, is how similar they are in so many ways, in terms of political systems, in terms of the economic concerns and threats and goals that they may have, whether it's vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis somebody else. The European Union, like the United States, these are the two places that have traditionally in the last 20 years been the major importers of Chinese products. and they both have had traditionally a very big trade imbalance, of course, with China as a consequence. And so, you know, I could go on about the transatlantic community, which is a sort of community ridden with conflict that always stays together, but is never united. And, you know, I can come up with other paradoxical statements if you want, but, you know, that's the sort of one of the things about that. Now, I almost forget what the other point are. In terms of the broader picture, I think what I mean by sort of transactional is that much of the relationship, particularly whether it's the United States, whether it's China, when it comes down to that rest of the world category, the states in development that are other than China, in other words, they're not necessarily looking towards aligning themselves with a particular ideology, with a particular country, but they're looking for the best possible deal. And of course, if you take Africa as an example, this is where China has been very successful in providing development assistance, much more so than any other one country or bloc even. They're not necessarily win-win things. That developmental assistance doesn't always come without any strings, but it is, you know, if that's the best deal on offer, of course, we're going to see recipients of that. And I think one of the challenges for the United States is to somehow transactionally try to match that Chinese, the lure of the Chinese. It doesn't mean that there is a great demand for Xi Jinping thought or Mao thought or whatever thought in sub-Saharan Africa or anywhere else. Much as it doesn't, you know, there's not necessarily the sort of big demand for, I don't know, neoliberal ideas in those parts of the world. What it means is that that the sort of, in historical terms, we think about the Cold War as being a period in which ideological conflicts were at least part of the picture. Of course, much of this transactional stuff was going on already then. Well, that ideological framework seems to have sort of, in some ways, disappeared. No matter how much Joe Biden says he's the leader of the free world, what is that free world today, as opposed to, you know, when John F. Kennedy was saying that very same thing? Is not very clear to most of us, I think. At least not to me, but I'm a simpleton, so there we are. Anyway, I hope I answered some of your points.
And I'd like to take a question online because a few of them have actually come in. So the first question here is, the USA has clearly decided not to afford Russia the same claim to a sphere of influence that it has claimed for itself in all of Latin America, leaving aside US involvement in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Africa. What is the likelihood that the US government will recognize China's claim for a sphere of influence in the South China Sea?
That's a very interesting question, yes, indeed. So it's a bit problematic, the question also, because when we talk about spheres of influence, if we think in terms of, obviously, okay, start the first point, the United States in Latin America. Obviously, that sphere of influence has been sort of evaporating over the past decades quite significantly. The United States is not, the Monroe Doctrine of old is really not, we cannot really make reference to that, except if you want to really paint the United States as the imperial power, sending the Marines whenever it wants, and doing all the nasty stuff that it always does, which is sort of one perception we seem to have about the United States today. More broadly, I think there's sort of hidden in the question, it seems to me, there's this equivalency thing, which is a bit false. But what we hear a lot, and why history is problematic, useful, instrumentalizing is fairly easy and straightforward, but misuse and abuse and all of that also comes along. So I think the implication is that it's sort of that the United States should not be complaining about Ukraine and Russia in Ukraine because the United States has done all those things in the past. And I think there is something qualitatively different in the end, probably, I would argue, in the sort of claims that have been made by Russia about Ukraine and its sovereignty, its nationhood, and the right, and why the West provoked all of this, and the various historical narratives that seem to contradict themselves sometimes, but can be useful at any given moment, as opposed to the stupidity of the United States engaging in an invasion of Iraq in 2003 without thinking through the consequences, the rationale behind that particular invasion. So there's some false equivalency. Now, in terms of spheres of influence in general, for the United States, that is not something that they accept in principle. Spheres of influence is not in the official American lexicon when it comes down to making foreign and security policy. No president is going to go out and say Latin America is in our sphere of influence and so forth. So in that sense, never going to happen. In the real world, of course, the United States has interests and greater interest in certain parts of the world, but behaviorally, I think the United States certainly at the moment is in a place in which using military force is extremely difficult. Outright military force directly, American soldiers going anywhere in the world is quite difficult. So it is not, in that sense, quite clear where those spheres of influence in fact are. And I think it's part because military force has proved so counterproductive for the United States in all kinds of levels. In terms of, people used to look up to the United States in many parts of the world, but that, I think, today is not really the case anymore. And so that's in part a consequence of that use of that hard power in places and then messing up quite significantly those places and leaving them behind in a state of utter unrepair, if you will, if you want to use that framework. So the crux of the question is about China and that. I think there is already, to some degree, there is already the sort of informal acknowledgement that China clearly is the major power in the Far East, in East Asia, that its sphere of influence is, while not formally acknowledged, has to be to a degree accepted, certainly when it comes down to North Korea and certain places like that. But because China doesn't make these kinds of claims, it's in a way that you can see that coming into sort of Russian officials, et cetera, et cetera. China doesn't make these claims. It doesn't claim that we have a right. In fact, the Chinese language is often very different. It's about sovereignty that needs to be respected. Not the Taiwanese version of it, but otherwise. And so it's very difficult to, South China Sea. Well, it's about sovereignty, but it's claims of the claims are about sovereignty, and that part of that South China Sea is that China is sovereign there and not the others, right? And a bit more, and so forth. So yeah, it's I guess short answer is it's not going to be an official acknowledgement of anything, but in terms of how the United States regards risks and takes and balances the risk with reward and so forth. Obviously, they're not going to push too hard to sort of create a situation of no return.
Thank you very much for that. There's about 30 seconds left, which I don't think will be enough to take another question and do it justice. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this lunch briefing. Thank you, Professor Hanhimäki, for presenting. And thank you to all of those online. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.